The year was 1191, though time in the Levant does not move by the counting of years, but by the rhythmic pulse of the tide and the slow, agonizing rot of meat. Outside the walls of Acre, the air did not carry the scent of salt or cedar. It carried the heavy, cloying sweetness of gangrene and the metallic tang of dried blood. To an observer from a distance, the Crusader camp might have looked like a field of white lilies, the silk of noble tents shimmering under a sun that did not care for the titles of men. But inside those tents, the soldiers of God were melting. The King of England lay in the center of this sweltering labyrinth. Richard, the Coeur de Lion, was no longer a golden icon carved in stone. He was a creature of sweat and bile, consumed by the Arnaldia, the mysterious, hair-stripping fever that turned the skin into parchment and the mind into a fractured mirror. The weight of the crowned flesh. To rule is to be a prisoner of expectations. Richard lay upon a cot draped in damask, his breath coming in shallow, ragged rasps. The smell of his own body disgusted him. It was the smell of a man already being claimed by the earth. In the corner of the tent, a copper brazier burned with frankincense, a futile attempt to mask the scent of the dying. Philosophy often visits a man when his muscles fail him. Richard stared at the shadows dancing on the silk ceiling and thought of the nature of kingship. Is a king more than the sum of the men he consumes? A monarch feeds on the taxes of the poor, the blood of the knight, and the time of the counselor. He is a great golden mouth that swallows the world to sustain a single name. And now, as the fever stripped the hair from his head and the strength from his limbs, Richard felt the terrifying lightness of being. If he could not lead, if he could not kill, was he still a lion? Or was he merely a shivering animal, waiting for the butcher? The silence of the tent was broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of the trebuchets, the bad neighbor and the god's own catapult, hurling stones against the stubborn walls of Acre. Each impact was a heartbeat. Thump, thump. The world was trying to break, but it was Richard who felt the cracks. The hunger of the soul. The king's physician, a man whose hands were stained permanently yellow from herbal poultices, knelt by the bed. He spoke of humors and alignment, of cooling the blood with rosewater. But Richard did not want rosewater. His hunger was not of the stomach, yet it manifested as a gnawing void. There is a specific type of isolation that belongs only to the powerful. In the camp, 10,000 men shouted his name, yet none knew the texture of his fear. To his soldiers, he was a force of nature, a lightning bolt forged in Normandy. To his enemies, he was a demon. To himself, in the dark hours of the afternoon when the sun turned the tent into an oven, he was a hollow vessel. "I cannot eat," Richard whispered, his voice like grinding gravel. "The fruit from Damascus has arrived, sire," the physician murmured. "Saladin, in his strange mercy, has sent pears and snow from the mountains." Richard laughed, a sound that ended in a wet cough. The mercy of a rival is the sharpest blade of all. To be fed by the man you intend to behead is a spiritual castration. He pushed the silver bowl of chilled fruit away. The pears looked like the pale, cold hands of ghosts. He thought of time. It seemed to him that the siege of Acre had lasted since the beginning of the world. Time is not a straight line in the desert. It is a circle, like the vultures that hovered above the trenches. He began to wonder if he would ever leave this place, or if his destiny was to become part of the very dust he sought to conquer. What is freedom to a king? It is the ability to choose one's own cage. And he had chosen this sun-scorched cage of holy war. The shifting perception. As the fever peaked, the boundaries between the king's memory and his surroundings began to blur. He smelled the damp forests of Aquitaine, the cold rain of London, the iron of his father's armor. Then, the smell of the camp would rush back. The latrines, the scorched sand, the boiling pitch. He heard the voices of his knights outside the flap. They were talking about the great hunger in the lower ranks. Men were eating their horses. Some were whispered to be boiling the leather of their boots. The Crusader state was a parasite that had run out of hosts. "If the king dies," a voice whispered, "the cross falls." The weight of that responsibility was more suffocating than the heat. To hold the faith of a continent in your diseased hands is a form of madness. Richard closed his eyes and saw a vision. A great lion standing over a carcass, but as he looked closer, the lion was eating its own paws. We are all devouring ourselves, he thought. The war is a mouth, the cross is a tooth, and God is the silent witness to the feast. The afternoon shadows lengthened, stretching across the rug like long, dark fingers. The king felt a sudden, sharp craving. It was not for fruit, nor for bread, nor for the cooling snow of the Saracens. It was a darker, more primal urge, a need to reclaim his strength, to ingest the vitality of the world, to be the predator once more. In the chronicles, they say Richard asked for pork, a meat forbidden to the heathens he fought. But the truth of a fevered mind is rarely found in the sanitized ink of a monk's quill. In the isolation of his tent, Richard the Lionheart began to look at the world not as a kingdom to be ruled, but as a banquet of life and death. The first part of the king's transformation was not of the flesh, but of the spirit. He had realized that to survive the pressure of his own legend, he had to become something beyond human. He had to become the beast that the poets claimed he was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the walls of Acre in the color of dried blood, the king finally reached for a piece of meat offered by a silent servant. He did not ask what it was. He only knew that it was warm, and that it promised to fill the void where his soul used to be. The history of the world is written in the blood of the innocent, but the legends of kings are written in the secrets they swallow. And here, in the stifling heat of the Levant, the lion began to hunt in the dark. Reflection on the first station. Is there a difference between the king who commands 1,000 men to die and the man who puts his teeth to their skin? Both seek to sustain their own existence through the destruction of another. We call one strategy and the other monstrosity. But perhaps the only difference is the distance between the mouth and the wound. The dawn that followed the king's first taste was not a herald of hope, but a lid of hammered brass closing over the world. The fever had broken, yet it left behind a hollow man, a vessel scrubbed clean of its previous contents. Richard stood at the entrance of his tent, the silk heavy in his hand, watching the dust devils dance between the lines of the sick. Recovery is a slow betrayal. As the body heals, it remembers its weaknesses. But Richard did not feel weak. He felt expanded. The meat, whatever its origin, had carried a potency that no Damascus pear could provide. It was as if he had ingested the very will to survive, the geometry of despair. He walked through the camp, his presence a silent command for the dying to stand. The great hunger was no longer a rumor. It was a physical presence, a gray dog that sat at every fire. He saw his knights, men who had once dreamed of glory in the courts of Poitiers, now staring at the horizon with eyes that looked like empty wells. Faith is a fragile thing when the stomach is empty. Richard realized that the crusade was not failing because of the Saracen walls, but because of the erosion of the human spirit. A man who has lost his dignity cannot reclaim a holy city. And what is dignity but the illusion that we are more than meat? He found himself standing by the cook fires of the commoners. There was a smell there, salty, thick, and unfamiliar. They called it the lion stew, a joke whispered in the dark. He watched a young squire stir a pot, his movements mechanical, his face a mask of exhaustion. "What sustains you?" Richard asked, his voice low. The squire did not look up. "The hope of the end, sire. Either the wall falls or we do. The alchemy of power." In the quiet of his solar, Richard met with his inner circle. They spoke of reinforcements, of Philip of France's wavering resolve, of the supply ships that were always a week away. Richard heard their words as one hears the buzzing of flies. They were talking about the old world, the world of logistics and treaties. He was thinking of the new world he had discovered in the height of his fever. A world where the king is the ultimate consumer. To lead these men, he had to be more than a general. He had to be a myth. And myths are not built on bread and water. They are built on the transgression of boundaries. "We will take the city within the month," Richard announced. The certainty in his voice startled them. It was a cold, crystalline sound. How, sire? A veteran knight asked. The men are too weak to scale the ladders. They will find strength, Richard replied, his eyes fixed on a map of Acre. I will provide the feast. That night the king did not sleep. He sat with his chaplain, a man whose faith was as sharp and unforgiving as a razor. They spoke of the Israelites in the desert, of the sacrifices of old, of the blood that washes away sin. Richard was looking for a theological justification for a hunger he could not name. Is a soul lost if it does what is necessary to preserve the light? Richard asked. The chaplain looked at the king's shadow on the wall. It looked immense, distorted by the flickering candlelight. The light requires a lamp, sire. If the lamp breaks, the darkness wins. The preservation of the king is the preservation of the will of God. The bitter communion. As the bells of the camp rang for the midnight vigil, a small group of prisoners was led toward the king's private quarters. They were Saracen scouts captured during a night raid. They were young, their skin the color of polished mahogany, their eyes wide with the terror of the unknown. Richard watched them from the darkness. He felt no hatred for them. Hatred is a luxury for those who still believe in the sanctity of the individual. To Richard, they were simply resources. They were the fuel for the engine of his ambition. He remembered the smell of the forest in winter, the way the wolves would circle a fallen deer. There was no malice in the wolf, only a profound, biological necessity. He stepped into the light. The prisoners fell silent. The King of England looked at them, not as a judge, but as a man looking at a miracle. He reached out and touched the shoulder of the nearest boy. The skin was warm. Life pulsed beneath it. A frantic, rhythmic drumming. Time is a thief, Richard whispered in a language they did not understand. But today I shall steal some back. The conclusion of the second act was not marked by a shout, but by a heavy, deliberate silence. The king had accepted his role in the dark hierarchy of the world. He was no longer just a man of war. He was the consumer of destiny. As the moon reached its zenith, casting a silver pall over the tents of the Crusaders, the first secret of the Lion's Feast was sealed. The history books would speak of the king's miraculous recovery. They would speak of divine intervention. But the earth beneath the king's tent knew the truth, a truth that tasted of salt, iron, and the terrible price of immortality. Reflection on the second station. What is a sacrament but the act of making the invisible visible? In the act of consumption, the king made visible the truth of his power, that all authority rests upon the ability to take. To rule is to eat. To be ruled is to be eaten. In the silence of the night, the lion found his peace in the heart of the predator. The month progressed like a slow-moving execution. Acre was a wound that refused to heal. The walls, scarred by 1,000 impacts, stood like the teeth of a giant, broken but still biting. Richard, now fully recovered, no longer rode his white charger with the flamboyant grace of a troubadour. He moved with a heavy, predatory deliberateness. His eyes, once bright with the fire of the Plantagenets, had settled into a cold, obsidian stillness. The transformation was noticed, though never named. His knights spoke of his iron will, but in the taverns of the camp, the soldiers whispered of the king's shadow. They said the king no longer slept. They said he walked the trenches at night, smelling the air like a hound. The architecture of the siege. To break a city is to understand its anatomy. Richard spent his days at the accursed tower, supervising the miners who dug beneath the foundations. The earth here was soft, yielding like flesh. As they ton-fed, the smell of ancient damp and forgotten burials rose to meet them. Richard found a strange comfort in the mines. Here, away from the blinding sun, the world was reduced to the tactile and the immediate. The grit in the mouth, the dampness of the walls, the steady clink-clink of the pickaxes. What is time to a stone? 1,000 years of standing, only to be brought down by a few days of fire and iron. Richard touched a support beam. We spend our lives building walls of stone, of faith, of law, only to realize that the most effective way to cross a boundary is to destroy it. To be free is to be the one who decides what remains standing. He thought of Saladin, his noble shadow on the other side. They exchanged gifts and pleasantries, but they were both engaged in the same grisly mathematics. How many lives equal a wall? How much blood is required to lubricate the gears of history? The Feast of the Lion. The rumor of the king's meat had spread. It was said that Richard had discovered a secret recipe of spices from the Far East that allowed him to fight for 3 days without rest. The soldiers, desperate for any edge against the heat and the enemy, began to crave it. A dark liturgy began to form. In the flickering light of the campfires, men spoke of the king's strength as something contagious. If they could only partake in what he partook, perhaps they too could become lions. Richard watched this from his high pavilion. He realized that a leader does not just command. He provides the substance of being. If the crusade was to succeed, the men had to shed their humanity. They had to become a single, hungry organism. The smell of roasting meat became the dominant scent of the English camp. It was a heavy, fatty aroma that clung to the clothes and the hair. To the starving, it was the smell of heaven. To those with a sliver of conscience left, it was a haunting, familiar scent that they tried to ignore. "They are ready," Richard said to his chaplain as they watched the men sharpening their swords by the fires. The chaplain, his face gaunt, nodded. "They are no longer men, sire. They are a weapon." "Good," Richard replied. "Men hesitate. Weapons do not." The fall of the first wall. On the 12th of July, the siege reached its breaking point. The miners had finished their work, filling the tunnels with brushwood and pig fat. As the sun reached its zenith, the fires were lit. The ground groaned. A sound like a deep, tectonic sob echoed from beneath the city. Then, with a slow, majestic violence, a section of the wall collapsed. The dust rose in a golden cloud, obscuring the sun. Richard did not wait for the dust to settle. He was the first through the breach. He did not lead with a shout, but with a terrifying, silent efficiency. His axe rose and fell like a butcher's blade. He was not fighting for the cross. He was harvesting. The sensory overload of the breach was a madness of its own. The taste of dust, the sound of screams muffled by the settling stone, the sight of limbs tangled in the rubble. Richard felt an incredible clarity. In the act of killing, he felt the most alive. It was the ultimate consumption, taking the life force of another to fuel his own momentum. By evening, the banner of the lion flew over the ruins of the wall. The city had not yet surrendered, but its soul was broken. Richard stood on a pile of masonry, his armor stained so dark it looked black in the fading light. He looked out over the city he had spent months trying to reach. It looked small. It looked fragile. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of disappointment. Is this all? Is the goal always less than the hunger? He realized then that the destination was irrelevant. The true power was in the process, the breaking, the eating, the becoming. As the night fell, the king ordered a great fire to be lit in the breach. He sat before it, watching the sparks fly up toward the indifferent stars. The soldiers brought him a plate of meat, the finest cuts from the day's harvest. Richard took a bite. It was salt and iron. It was the taste of victory. And in the silence of his heart, he knew that he could never go back to being a man of bread and wine. He had crossed the final threshold. He was the lion and the world was his carrion. Reflection on the third station. Freedom is not the absence of walls, but the power to break them. But every wall we break leaves a scar upon the soul. When the king broke the walls of Acre, he also broke the last barrier between himself and the abyss. In the rubble of the city, he found his throne, but he also found his cage. The eternal, unquenchable hunger for more. The city of Acre surrendered not with a roar, but with a whimper. The gates opened like the mouth of a corpse, letting out a stream of the hollow-cheeked and the broken. For the Crusaders, this was the moment of redemption, the reclaiming of a piece of the Holy Land. But for Richard, the victory felt as thin as the air atop a mountain. Sharp, cold, and lonely. The spoils of the spirit. Richard took residence in the royal palace of Acre. The rooms were tiled in intricate patterns of blue and gold, cooling to the touch. Yet, he felt more out of place here than he had in the muddy trenches. The luxury was a mask. The true face of the city was in the shadows of its alleyways, where the smell of death still lingered. Isolation is the shadow cast by greatness. As he sat at the long marble table, surrounded by the kings of Europe and the masters of the orders, Richard realized that they were all performing a play. They spoke of the true cross, of Christian duty, and of chivalric honor. To Richard, these words were empty shells. He had seen the machinery behind the curtain. He knew that the world was not fueled by honor, but by the raw, desperate exchange of life. He looked at Philip II of France. Philip was a man of politics, of small gains and careful maneuvers. He was a man who ate partridges and drank watered wine. Richard looked at him and felt a profound, almost divine, disgust. How can a man rule if he is afraid to touch the core of existence? The burden of the hostages. The surrender had come with a heavy price. 3,000 Saracen hostages, held until Saladin paid the ransom and returned the true cross. These thousands became a weight upon the neck of the army. They occupied the space, they consumed the water, and they stared. Richard visited the hostages in the heat of the noon sun. They were tethered together like cattle, their white robes stained with the filth of their captivity. They did not beg. They simply waited. Their silence was a judgment. What is a life worth in the ledger of a king? To the diplomat, it is a bargaining chip. To the priest, it is a soul to be saved. To the lion, it is a debt of energy. Richard stood before a young Saracen man, perhaps the same age he had been when he first drew blood in Aquitaine. The man looked at him, and for a moment the king saw a reflection of himself. Not the lion, but the prisoner. We are all hostages to something. Richard was a hostage to his own legend, a prisoner of the hunger he had invited into his heart. Saladin will not pay, Richard whispered to the wind. He knows the value of time. He is waiting for the weight of you to crush me. The Black Decision. On the 20th of August, the sun was a white-hot eye in the center of the sky. The deadline for the ransom had passed. The air in the camp was thick with the tension of a bowstring pulled too tight. The soldiers were restless. The feast had ended, and the old gray hunger was returning. Richard stood on the balcony of the palace, watching the sea. The water was a flat, sapphire blue, indifferent to the dramas of men. He called for his marshals. "The hostages," Richard said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Take them to the plain of Iadea." "All of them, sire?" the marshal asked, his voice trembling. "All of them," Richard replied. "The weight must be shed. The lion cannot hunt with 1,000 anchors dragging in the sand." The execution was not a battle. It was a harvest. 3,000 men were led to the plain, under the very eyes of Saladin's outposts. There was no music, no banners, just the rhythmic, mechanical sound of the blades. Richard watched from a distance. He did not turn away. He felt a strange, cold peace. By destroying these thousands, he was reaffirming his own existence. He was the one who decided the end. He was the mouth of the world. The smell of the plain that evening was something that no chronicler would ever dare to describe. It was the smell of a world being stripped of its pretense. The blood soaked into the parched earth, turning the dust into a dark, viscous mud. That night the king did not eat. He did not need to. He felt full of the silence of the 3,000. He felt heavy with the finality of his choice. He sat in his gold-tiled room and listened to the sound of the surf. The sea did not care. The stars did not care. Richard realized that this was the ultimate freedom, to be so far beyond the reach of human judgment that one could stand alone in the dark, a god of bone and salt. Reflection on the fourth station. Victory is a mirror that shows us what we have become. In the massacre of Acre, the king did not just kill his enemies. He killed the last remnants of his own mercy. To be a king is to be a desert, vast, unforgiving, and beautiful in its desolation. The lion had cleared the field, but he was now the only thing left alive in the landscape of his own making. The army marched south. The coast was a line of white fire where the desert met the sea. Richard led the vanguard, his armor now a dull, bruised gray, the polish long since surrendered to the sand. The march toward Jaffa was a trial of attrition, a journey through a world that wanted to erase the very memory of Europe. The desolation of movement. To march is to become a machine. The Crusader host moved in a tight, defensive formation, a wall of shields and spears that groaned under the weight of the sun. The heat was a physical weight, a heavy blanket that smelled of hot iron and dry wool. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Every breath was a lung-searing draft of dust. Richard watched his men. They were no longer the vibrant knights of the tournament circuit. They were ghosts wrapped in chainmail. He saw the way they looked at the horizon, not with hope, but with the flat, dead stare of those who have seen too much. What is a journey but a slow shedding of the self? With every mile, they left a piece of their past behind. The stories of their homes in Sussex or the Auvergne felt like fairy tales told in a language they no longer spoke. Here, there was only the sun, the sand, and the silent, ever-present shadow of Saladin's light horsemen. Is the path to heaven always through such a hell? A young monk asked as he stumbled beside the king's horse. Richard looked down at him. His eyes were like cold embers. Heaven is a destination for the weary. We are not going to heaven. We are going to war. The mirage of salvation. As the thirst set in, the mind began to play tricks. Men saw shimmering lakes where there was only salt. They heard the sound of bells from cathedrals that were thousands of miles away. The desert is a mirror that reflects the heart's deepest fears and desires. Richard, too, saw visions. He saw the face of his mother, Eleanor, but her eyes were the black pits of the hostages at Iadea. He heard the voice of his father, Henry, laughing in the rustle of the dry grass. But most of all, he saw the void. There is a point where thirst ceases to be a sensation and becomes a philosophy. It is the realization that the world is inherently empty, and that we are all just fragile vessels trying to hold on to a liquid that is constantly evaporating. To be a lion in a land of salt is to realize that the only thing you can truly possess is your own hunger. He found himself drinking less than his men, not out of piety, but out of a strange, dark curiosity. How far can the body go when the soul has already reached the end? He felt a terrifying lightness, as if his spirit were becoming as thin and sharp as a Damascus blade. The encounter at Arsuf. On the 7th of September, the heat reached a crescendo. At the forest of Arsuf, the silence of the march was broken by the thunder of the Saracen charge. The air was suddenly filled with the scream of arrows, the whistle of death that the knights had come to dread. The battle was not a grand display of chivalry. It was a chaotic, grinding collision of flesh and iron. Richard moved through the fray with a horrifying grace. He did not shout, he did not command. He simply existed in the center of the storm, a whirlwind of steel. He felt the impact of his axe through his arms, the jarring vibration of bone breaking beneath mail. He smelled the iron of the blood, the acrid smoke of the brushfires, the musk of the horses. In the height of the slaughter, he felt a surge of that old, dark ecstasy. He saw a Saracen emir, a man of noble bearing, his silk robes fluttering in the wind. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, a moment of profound, wordless recognition. They were both predators in a landscape of prey. Richard struck him down, not with hatred, but with a sense of completion. He was not just killing an enemy. He was absorbing the moment. The Battle of Arsuf was a victory, but it was a victory of the parched. As the sun set, the Crusaders stood amongst the dead, their tongues swollen, their hearts hollow. They had survived, but the price was a deeper layer of their humanity. Richard stood at the edge of the forest, looking back toward the north. The dust of the battle was settling, turning the sky into a bruised purple. He felt the familiar, gnawing ache in his chest, the hunger that no victory could satisfy. "We move at dawn," he told his commanders. He walked back toward his tent, his footsteps heavy in the sand. He realized that the road to Jaffa was not a path to a city, but a descent into the final chamber of his own soul. He had become the thing he once feared, a man who could only feel the sun when it burned, and only feel his heart when it was full of the salt of the earth. Reflection on the fifth station. The desert does not test your strength. It tests your emptiness. On the road to Jaffa, the king discovered that he was a vessel made of shadows. To survive the heat, he had to become the heat. To survive the thirst, he had to become the desert. In the silence of the march, the lion realized that his greatest enemy was not Saladin, but the terrible, beautiful void that lived within the center of his own crown. Twice Richard led his army toward Jerusalem, and twice he stood on the hills of Emmaus, where the white stone of the holy city shimmered on the horizon like a dream that refuses to be grasped. The air here was thinner, carrying the scent of pine and ancient prayer, but for Richard, it smelled only of salt and unfinished business. The shield over the eyes. There is a legend that Richard refused to look upon Jerusalem, covering his face with his shield. Lord God, he is said to have cried, I pray that I may never see thy holy city if I cannot deliver it from the hands of thy enemies. But the shield was not just to hide the city from his eyes. It was to hide his eyes from the city. Richard knew that if he took Jerusalem, the myth of the Lionheart would be complete. And a completed myth is a dead thing. He was afraid not of failure, but of the end of the hunger. To rule Jerusalem would be to settle, to build, to be a man of peace. And the thing that had grown inside him during the Arnaldia could not live in peace. It was a creature of the siege, the march, and the breach. He looked at his army, a ragged, coughing assembly of the disillusioned. They wanted to go home. They wanted the green fields of England and the damp mists of Normandy. They were tired of being lions. We retreat, Richard commanded, the words tasting like ash. The silence that followed was louder than any battle cry. In that moment, the Lionheart became a man again, but a man who had forgotten how to live without the shadow of the axe. The Treaty of the Two Shadows. In the end, it was not a glorious charge that ended the war, but a piece of parchment. The Treaty of Jaffa was a compromise between two exhausted predators. Saladin would keep the city. The Christians would keep the coast and the right to pilgrimage. Richard and Saladin never met. They remained shadows to each other, two giants holding up the sky of the Levant. They exchanged horses and fruit, but they kept their hearts behind their own walls. Richard realized that his true kin was not the kings of Europe, but the man he had spent 3 years trying to destroy. They were both prisoners of the roles the world had cast for them. As he boarded his ship at Acre, Richard looked back at the receding shoreline. The Levant was a furnace that had burned away everything he once believed about himself. He was leaving as a failure in the eyes of the church, but as a legend in the eyes of history. The return to the rain. The journey home was another kind of siege. He was captured in Austria, held in a cold stone cell where the only sound was the drip of water and the beating of his own heart. The lion was in a cage, and the world paid a king's ransom to see him free. When he finally returned to England, the air was cold and damp. The green of the fields felt alien, almost offensive in its softness. He moved through his own kingdom like a stranger. The people cheered for the icon, but they did not see the man whose hair had been stripped by fever and whose soul had been salted by the desert. He did not stay long. He could not. The hunger returned, a quiet, insistent drumming in his blood. He went to war again, this time in France, fighting over small castles and petty borders. He was looking for the breach again, for the moment where the world breaks and the predator is free. The final harvest. In 1199, at the siege of Calas-Chabrol, a minor skirmish over a supposed hoard of gold, the lion found his end. It was not a Saracen emir who struck him down, but a lone crossbowman, a boy who had lost his father and brothers to Richard's wars. The bolt struck him in the shoulder, a messy, undignified wound. As the gangrene set in, Richard felt a strange sense of recognition. This was the Arnaldia again, the slow rot that he had first felt in Acre. The circle was closing. He called for the boy who had shot him. The boy expected torture. Richard gave him gold and forgiveness. It was his final transgression, his final break from the script. In his dying moments, he realized that the greatest victory was not taking a city, but letting go of the need to consume it. I am the meat now, he whispered as the darkness crowded into the room. He died in the arms of his mother, the only person who had ever truly known the weight of his crown. The lion was gone, leaving behind a trail of blood, a broken wall, and a name that would ring through the centuries like a bell in a deserted cathedral. Reflection on the final station. History is a banquet where we eat the stories of the dead to nourish our own legends. Richard the Lionheart was both the guest and the meal. He taught us that power is a fire that consumes the vessel that carries it. In the end, the lion and the carrion are the same, just parts of the earth, waiting for the wind to blow away the dust of their ambition.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.